new.
We're very glad that you've joined us tonight for our public lecture. This is the culminating piece of a weekend of events that we've had here at the church to reflect on the moral injury of war. The reason that we're having this event here, just to put this in context, is that we've been reflecting as a church community over the course of a year on how we discern the unique calling of our lives and how we as individuals in a community will respond with love and justice to the needs of the world. With the fact that we have now 3 armed conflicts actively engaged by the United States, the question of how we are to live our lives, how we are to address power, and what love and justice look like in the world are all the more important. So we're very glad that you're here. For us in our religious community, religion is about identifying the key ultimate concerns that we have as individuals and communities, understanding what our unique gifts are to those, and I know that Chris Hedges will have a lot to offer our discussion this evening. So I'll begin with the modern obligatory announcement. If you've got any noisemakers, a cell phone, anything else that goes beep in the night, please go ahead and silence it so that we can be present for the lecture this evening. We are very pleased to have Chris Hedges with us in our sanctuary and offering his wisdom and thoughts with us this evening. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer-prize winning journalist. He's spent around 2 decades as a foreign correspondent, many of those years with the New York Times, and many of those years specifically in areas that are affected by or currently engaged in combat. He has experience all the way from Central America, conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. He is the son of a Presbyterian minister, is that right? And was educated in his graduate work at Harvard Divinity School. So in addition to Mr. Hedges' experience with political, social conflict and his ability to provide social analysis on the world, he brings a very deep awareness of how religion plays a role in these major world issues, and we are very excited to have him here tonight. So if you will, please join me in welcoming Chris Hedges to our lecture this evening.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about both war and empire because they're intimately linked. I don't socialize much in Princeton, which if any of you have lived in Princeton, you'll understand why. But I had a dinner shortly after Barack Obama was elected president with several Princeton professors, including one of whom had been my department head. I've taught off and on at Princeton. I taught in the program in American Studies. And it was on the war in Afghanistan. I had organized with a friend of mine, Russell Banks, great novelist, Francine Prose, Mark Kurlansky, all fine writers with a deep moral conscience, a letter that had been published in the New York Review of Books and The Nation. We had gotten about 100 writers, not only gotten 100 writers to sign it, but somehow squeezed $50 out of each of them, which is not a process I'd ever want to go through again, to pay for it, calling on Obama to withdraw from Afghanistan immediately. And at this dinner, all of these professors were opposed to the stance that I and other writers had taken, arguing that we had gone into Afghanistan to liberate women. Now, for those of us, such as myself, who have spent as many years as I have in the maw of organized industrial violence, this was an utter absurdity. When you understand what TOW missiles and cruise missiles and Hellfire missiles, which actually, when they explode, suck all the oxygen out of the air around you, when you understand what 90-millimeter tank rounds do and 155 howitzers and belt-fed saws, the very idea that you can have a discussion about human rights in the midst of a war zone makes no sense. And yet, this was something that, although I was certainly speaking from experience, this was something that everybody at this dinner didn't want to hear. And it became quite a disturbing event for me because I was forced to speak in the kind of rational discourse that one employs as an academic environment about an experience, a deeply personal experience, which finally engenders nothing but hysteria. And as I was trying to argue against the idea that American empire could impose virtue through violence, I began to resurrect internally very disturbing images of trauma, images that, of course, all of us who have been exposed to combat carry. And left that dinner and that's the last time I've ever had a dinner in Princeton outside of the dinner with my family. I have to cope with that idea so prevalent in American society, in my public life. But as I told my wife, who is Canadian and doesn't have it within her DNA to think that she can go around the world as a Canadian imposing Canadian values by force on other people, that I won't, that I can't confront it. And I think that in large part that's the problem that those of us who come back from the outer edges of empire have. All of the great writers who have struggled with these issues, Conrad, for instance, or E.M. Forrester, Dos Passos. Finally, when you face what it is that is done in our name and that we do, you are forever sort of alienated from the society in which you live. And it's a painful alienation. It is an alienation which runs up against so much. It's naive, but it's a naive kind of goodness, a kind of belief in American exceptionalism and American values that are utterly shattered when you are standing, as I have in Gaza, in a refugee camp that is being pounded by 500 and 1,000-pound bombs dropped by American-made F-16s, or when you're in southern Iraq, or whether you're in Bosnia or anywhere else. Its war itself is finally unexplainable. It's to those who haven't experienced it. And of course, the images that come out of war are so heavily sanitized that people never see, unless they've been there, what war is. Even the images, the very graphic images that were broadcast from Sarajevo, and when I was in Sarajevo, it was being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. Even those images never began to portray what these shells did to human bodies, to the evisceration of human bodies. When people die in combat, it's never like it is in the movies or on television. It's far more akin to butchering an animal. Even very grievous wounds can leave someone bleeding to death for hours. For instance, in the first Gulf War, I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and we had Iraqi, surrendering Iraqis who walked into anti-tank minefields and had their legs blown off. Nobody could reach them, and they lay there and bled to death for 6 hours. That's what war is like. And we certainly have the technological capacity to show us war, not only show us war, but show us war in real time. But if we ever saw it, we would be so revolted and disgusted and repulsed, it would become extremely difficult to wage war. I went to war, and many people have different motives that propels them into war, as an idealist. I was in seminary in the early 1980s at a time when despotic regimes had taken control of most of the countries in Latin America. The dirty war was underway in Argentina, where the military junta disappearing 30,000 of its own citizens. Pinochet was in Chile. Rios Montt was carrying out huge massacres in the highlands in Guatemala. The death squads in El Salvador were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. And like my great hero, George Orwell, I thought that this was as close as my generation was going to come to fighting fascism, or at least I thought that until 20 years later I returned to the United States. And so I went. Other people go to war for other reasons, as voyeurs, as drifters, as people who are attracted to violence. But once you get sucked into the maw of war itself, it really doesn't matter what your motives were. You become contaminated by the adrenaline rushes, by the hallucinogenic landscapes that are coughed up by combat. It is possible in a 24-hour period in combat to replicate probably every synthetic drug trip that you could take in Dallas, Texas, whether that's the kind of zombie-like, zoned-out, lack of sleep, sort of hashish-induced fog, whether it's the zip of adrenaline itself at a moment of intense fear. Combat itself is an experience that is Zen-like in its quality. You are aware in ways that you never were before. Even colors are brighter. The grotesque landscapes that you see caused by the destruction of weaponry is beyond the realm of imagination. I have a great problem with the whole idea or notion of heroism because I know from experience that so often we would do things in war zones which we were hardly conscious of. Certainly things that in a rational state I would never do now. And I also know that courage is never a constant. When you spend long enough in a war zone. There are always days when you are crippled with fear. So I went to El Salvador in the early 1980s. I had originally gone to seminary to be an inner-city minister, very influenced by my great mentor at Colgate University, the chaplain Coleman Brown, who had been an inner-city minister in Harlem and Chicago for many years, as well as the writer William Stringfellow, who had gone to Bates College, Harvard Law School, and then in the 1950s moved into Harlem to practice law. And his books, by the way, I think they're all out of print, but they're certainly worth digging up. They're absolutely brilliant moral meditations on poverty and the role of a Christian in a consumer imperial society. Absolutely beautifully written. There's a great story about Karl Barth coming to Union Theological Seminary, and of course nobody knew what to do with Stringfellow. The divinity school, the seminaries didn't want him, the law schools didn't want him, and when Barth arrived at Union, they asked him which theologian he would like to meet, and he said Stringfellow, to the dismay of all the doctorate professors of applied ethics and systematic theology at Union Theological Seminary. And I soured on the church while I was in Roxbury. I lived across the street from the Mission Extension Housing Project for 2.5 years.